Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 2 hours worth of horror stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. I'm not going to set a like goal for this one, just if you do enjoy, I would really deeply appreciate it if you drop a like. Subscribing, sharing, commenting, all of that is of course appreciated as well. I hope you've all been well. But let's go ahead and get into the stories. Sit back, grab a coffee, get cozy, whatever it is that you do to relax. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. The streets of New York were choked with humanity, a flowing river of souls seeking purpose, pleasure, and sometimes escape. Walking among them, I found a narrow alley that was not on any map. The entry was concealed by the haunting shadows cast by the imposing skyscrapers, but curiosity, that insatiable itch, drew me in. In the middle of the alley stood an unassuming shop with the words "Shop of Illusions" etched in ornate gold calligraphy above the door. There were no windows to peer into, only a sleek black door that looked as if it were made from shadows themselves. The hairs on my neck rose, but some inexplicable compulsion nudged me inside. The inside was unlike any shop I had ever seen. The walls pulsed with soft, iridescent hues, and the air carried a sweet, intoxicating aroma. Elegant glass cases displayed items that seemed to defy reality. A never-ending goblet of wine, a book whose characters leaped off the page, and a mirror showing not your reflection, but your deepest desires. Ah, a new seeker. A silky voice spoke from the back of the shop. A tall, lean man emerged, his features sharp as if chiseled from granite. His eyes, however, were the most captivating. They danced with colors not known to the human spectrum. Welcome to the Shop of Illusions, where dreams are reality, and reality is just a plaything of the mind, he announced, gesturing grandly. I hesitated. Illusions? Yes, he smiled, revealing unnaturally perfect teeth. Here we sell moments of respite from your world. Choose an illusion, indulge in it, and when it fades, return to reality, refreshed and invigorated. Curiosity piqued. What's the catch? His laughter was mellifluous, though it echoed oddly in the room. Ah, smart one. Every illusion, like a dream, fades, but sometimes, when dreams end, the waking world seems different, more intense. It sounded innocuous enough. Temptation wrestled with caution. Before I knew it, I found myself handing over a not insubstantial amount of money for an illusion of an unforgettable night of passion and love. As the man crafted the illusion, the world around me blurred and shifted. I was transported to an idyllic beach at sunset, the sky a canvas of purples, reds, and golds. A beautiful partner whose face seemed both familiar and unknown appeared beside me. The night was everything I had hoped for: warmth, affection, laughter. For a brief moment, I felt complete. But as all dreams must, it ended. The sun rose, and with it the illusion began to crumble, the colors fading, the touch turning cold. I blinked, and suddenly I was back in the Shop of Illusions. The shopkeeper grinned, satisfaction evident. How was it? I nodded, a touch dazed. Incredible. But now, I feel empty? He supplied. Yes, that's often the effect. You see, when the illusion is so perfect, reality seems lacking. He was right. Exiting the shop, the bustling city felt drabber, more monochrome. The laughter of children sounded distant, food tasted bland, and every touch felt like a shadow of what I had felt in the illusion. A sinking feeling of dissatisfaction nestled within me. Days turned into weeks, and the allure of the shop of illusions grew impossible to resist. I returned, purchasing another illusion, and then another. Each time, the boundaries of reality and illusion blurred, and the world outside the shop became grayer, more muted. Each waking moment was tainted with longing for the next illusion. But one day, things took a sinister turn. Having spent nearly all my savings on the intoxicating illusions, I was desperate for just one more taste. I begged the shopkeeper for an affordable escape. After an eternity, he presented a tarnished silver key. This key opens the door to the most powerful illusion yet. But remember, the greater the dream, the harsher the awakening. Without a second thought, I grabbed the key, and the world spun and twisted around me. I found myself in a magnificent mansion, surrounded by opulent riches. Servants awaited my every command, and every pleasure imaginable was at my fingertips. Days or maybe years passed in this illusionary paradise. But then, a nagging feeling began to creep in, a sense of being watched, hunted. One fateful evening, I stumbled upon a hidden chamber in the mansion. Inside there was a grotesque gallery, walls adorned with paintings that shifted and squirmed. Each painting depicted a distorted, nightmarish version of my own face, contorted with fear and agony. A chilling realization dawned. This wasn't just an illusion. It was a trap. Desperate to escape, I sought out the silver key. The mansion began to transform, corridors elongating, doors disappearing, and shadows coming to life. Whispered voices and malevolent laughter echoed around me. Every corner I turned, I was met with nightmarish scenes. Friends and family, their eyes hollow, mouths twisted into screams reaching out with rotting hands. The world darkened, and an oppressive weight settled on my chest. Panic surged, each heartbeat echoing loudly in my ears. In the distance, I spotted the familiar glint of the silver key on a pedestal, battling the terror and the grotesque apparitions. I lunged for it. The moment my fingers closed around the key, a searing pain shot up my arm. But I managed to turn it. Reality crashed back. The opulence of the mansion was replaced by the iridescent walls of the Shop of Illusions. Gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, I stumbled out, the silver key still clutched in my hand. But the world outside was no longer the one I remembered. The city streets, once bustling and vibrant, now seemed post-apocalyptic. Buildings crumbled, vehicles lay abandoned, and the few people I encountered had sunken eyes and gaunt faces. They shuffled aimlessly, their voices nothing more than hollow whispers. The most disturbing change, however, was the sky. It was a swirling vortex of inky black and blood red, casting the entire city in an eerie, pulsating glow. Horrified, I made my way back to the Shop of Illusions, only to find its door locked. Desperation mounting, I tried the silver key and, to my surprise, it fit. Inside, the shop was in chaos. The once beautiful displays were shattered, and the very walls seemed to weep. The shopkeeper sat hunched in a corner, a shadow of his former self. "What have you done?" he hissed, his once vibrant eyes now dull. "Me? What happened to the world?" He laughed. a sound devoid of any mirth. Your insatiable greed for illusions tore a rift between reality and fantasy. Now they're melding, blending, corrupting one another. I felt my knees weaken. How do we fix this? His gaze was filled with pity and regret. The balance must be restored. An illusion as potent as reality needs to counterbalance it. But I don't have any money left. No, not money, he said. Something much more valuable. Before I could react, he lunged at me, snatching the silver key from my hand. He whispered an incantation, and the key glowed with an ethereal light. Suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Looking down, I saw my heart. Not of flesh and blood, but a vibrant, swirling nebula of colors being pulled from my body. He placed it within the silver key and offered it to me. Your heart, your soul, the essence of your being is now an illusion, a perfect counterweight to the corrupted reality. Your sacrifice will restore the balance. Everything went dark. When I awoke, I was back on the familiar streets of New York, bustling with life. The shop of illusions was gone, replaced by an ordinary wall. Yet in my hand I held the silver key, pulsating softly, my heart encapsulated within. As I walked the streets, I felt an eerie calmness. I could hear the rhythm of the city, the whispers of the wind, the heartbeat of the earth. I could taste the sweetness of the air and see colors more vibrant than ever before. Every sensation was amplified, intense, overwhelming. The world was no longer gray and muted, but unbearably real. Now I am a wanderer, roaming the boundary of reality and illusion. In my chest is a void, an emptiness filled only by the faint pulsations of the silver key. And every so often, when the weight of reality becomes unbearable, I return to the illusions locked within my heart. But no matter how beautiful or enticing, they are but pale shadows compared to the terrifying beauty of reality. The price I paid in the shop of illusions was high, yet it has given me a lesson more valuable than any illusion. Reality, in all its raw, brutal, and breathtaking form, is the true magic. For what are illusions but dreams that fade away, leaving us yearning for the harsh yet enchanting embrace of reality. If you ask a scientist such as myself to define instinct, I will simply tell you that your body is made up of various neurons, most of which are crumpled around three main parts of the human system. In first place is the brain, having an outstanding number of approximately 86 billion neurons working together in relentless harmony that I wish I could see in all of mankind, while the second, the spinal cord, stays in millions, way down to the tail and equally as corresponding. These cells, of course, carry on multiple purposes, but the gist of it is that the more they are grouped like tangled web after tangled web, the greater they are at processing information. But the third one, the stomach, otherwise known as the second brain for its 500 million tally, is something more complex, more primitive in nature. While both the brain and the spine's reactions develop from situations your physical body can attest to and can prevent to any given obstacle, like how you immediately balance yourself after a misstep at the bottom of the stairs, gut instincts don't need your eyes or really any of your six senses to alert you of what danger is creeping from an unknown distance. It simply knows. That, in turn, sends you into a state of panic, a result of your mind trying to find and fix the problem it cannot comprehend. and the longer you try to pry for a solution, the more adrenaline is produced. But it's only a matter of minutes until your brain is released from the paranoid grasps of the gut and gets you back to Earth. Logic comes back into action, and after turning multiple times in a circle, you'll see that nothing's there and laugh it off. Undoubtedly, it's not enough, so you look around for one last time just to be sure, and the mind finally relaxes, pushing down the still uncomfortable gnawing in the pits of your stomach, which remains for as long as it likes, because of whatever reason I couldn't figure out until last night. Still, I was convinced that everything that's been happening in the last few weeks was a result of my formal leave from the lab. It had to be. I'd been getting these weird sensations in my stomach after day 4 of my leave, and I was impassively chalking it up to a stomach bug due to its severity. One that I acquired because my body was used to working and thinking to the brink of exhaustion for most of the time that I'm awake. It was only later in the day while buying medicine that I realized how my symptoms weren't lining up with the predicament that I had that heart-stopping coldness run up my spine. I hadn't felt it in so long it caught me off guard, and so strong that I clumsily dropped the tightly capped Pepto-Bismol I was checking out on the floor. The clacking sound of plastic against alabaster-colored tiles didn't help with the feeling of dread making its way through the concaves of my brain. In fact, the sound seemed to slowly reverberate off of every surface of the pharmacy. Relenting to the fear, I turned around and saw a bald-headed, tattooed mountain of a man in a spiked leather jacket glaring at me on the other side of the aisle he was towering over. But as soon as he saw me turn to face him, his expression changed to that of concern as he asked me if I was okay. He didn't seem to want to cause me any trouble after all, and I nodded shakily, feeling myself calm down enough to breathe, although looking back at the bottle I had picked up, I noticed my hands were cold, clammy, and trembling. The sensation was weird, almost different. I know I'd been privy to the ins and outs of this kind of instinct, but I remembered what they felt like, and they weren't supposed to be that strong, were they? That was the first day. The next time I felt it, I was sitting at the local coffee shop discussing next month's project with my coworkers when all of a sudden I felt something tight constricting my lower body, similar to the unyielding grasp of a determined python. I flinched, coughing up my drink, causing my lab partner Higgins to ask the same question as the man I saw 2 days prior. And then came the tickle up my spine as I vehemently moved my head around, looking for any suspicious behavior on everyone I could land my gaze on, but there was, once again, no sign of misconduct. Not one person inside or outside of the building was even bothering to spare me a moment's glance, too busy in their own little bubble to notice the almost frantic girl in the corner. I sighed and shook my head. Third time it appeared. I started to get uneasy. It was during a short trip to the grocery store, and without warning, the freezing hands of my gut went up to pluck my heart down as soon as I got the feeling of eyes drilling ever so extremely in the back of my head. 3 tries. 3 tries was all it took for my mind to succumb and flee. I wasted no time and jumped into my car and drove off to home, to safety. I paused, stopping the car abruptly. Safety from what, exactly? I am a woman of science, damn it. Seeing is believing. I gritted my teeth as a mixture of emotions flooded through me. I let my gut instincts drive instead of my head. It wasn't good. It felt like I was betraying myself. All of the control and mental challenges only to be erased by feelings prompted by something I couldn't see nor prove to even exist beyond my anxiousness. Enough was enough. It was at that time, 5 days ago that I ran through different probabilities as quickly as I could and came to the conclusion that I was being stalked, being toyed with. And I was right, but not in the way I would have listed, not in a way I even thought possible. I was being stalked, yes, not by someone, but by something. I am not one to believe in the supernatural, as you might have already guessed, but last night, I felt it again along with something else. 2 days ago, I had equipped myself with a gun because it wasn't just eyes that I felt on me anymore, and no longer when I was in public spaces. Instead, I knew it was there with me, always beside me in the car, in the store, in my room. I could feel it standing at the foot of my bed every time I reached for the lamp, but by all that is mighty, I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. I still told myself that whoever was stalking me had successfully broken into my house and was waiting for me somewhere in the room, in the closet, or under the bed just waiting for a chance to pounce. The fear was unbearable by then. Stronger than any kind of emotion I'd ever felt before or since. So when morning came yesterday, I had called the cops. Typically, they weren't convinced that the threat was real and told me to call them when I had real evidence or even a name. By night, I had sobbed to Higgins about my misfortune, although only because my gut was driving me crazy with the need for company and the relief of having someone believe me. Or maybe he didn't and just wanted to be a pillar in my time of need. It was my first breath of fresh air since this nightmare had all started. He stayed the night, offering me words of comfort, and agreed to stay up with me to watch whatever movie I wanted. It took some time to get my mind off of everything and focus on the film, but as fast as the terror went, it came back when I felt 3 slow, hard, deliberate pokes on the ball of my right shoulder, followed by the call of my name from between me and Higgins. Hello? Hello? A sharp, raspy whisper seemed to silence everything around me, and by the looks of it, Higgins wasn't far behind. My blood ran cold, and he turned pale as we quickly turned in unison, me having raised my revolver towards who or what it was that had startled us enough to warrant a piss in the pants. Nothing. My arms sagged and my knees buckled. Higgins took the liberty to drag me out of the house in a panicked haste, all while feeding me questions I wasn't really answering because for once in almost 3 weeks, my body felt light without the burden of my stomach telling me something was wrong. I was able to think again, and that's why I'm writing this now. I know a lot of people dedicate their lives to finding a bridge between our world and the hidden, but we already have it in ourselves. A way for mortals to sense trouble from the other side, from true evil, to a truly macabre yet fascinating connection to a world most want to reach. Science says these instincts are often wrong when used to judge our fellow men. And often not, yes, but maybe because it only applies to something it cannot see. That is, auras invisible to the naked eye or creatures of the veil watching our every move, waiting to strike. I'm probably wrong on some of that, but for now, it's a hypothesis, and I still need to wrap my head around this discovery. I don't know if I'm now a target of some demonic or otherwise supernatural entity. I don't know if it'll keep haunting me until I'm dead. Hell, I don't know if I would even be writing this if I didn't call Higgins. But I do know now that my gut instincts guided me through it. It always will. As for you all, if you ever feel like something is with you in an empty room, maybe as you even read this now, trust what your gut says, but don't forget to think. Stay safe, people. My parents were not super well off, and for a long time struggled to get ahead. My dad worked incredibly hard, stress and fights and all the stuff that comes with money troubles, but he'd saved enough to put a deposit on a home. I remember the first time I walked into that house. It was the day of the turnkey, and I was super excited to finally have a garden to play in. It was a 2-bedroom with a study, not very big. The whole house was painted shades of gray and black. From excitement, I felt this sinking feeling as I looked around. I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of wrongness. To put it into words is impossible. That feeling traveled up and down my body in waves, a mix of unease and trepidation with absolutely no explanation. I tried to tell my dad, and I remember him saying that it was just a big change and I'd get over it. I was a quiet kid, kept to myself, and swallowed it down. 11-year-old for my birthday, that year my parents decided to get me a cat. They took me to a breeder and they chose one. I don't like cats. I'd been bitten and scratched before, but I said thank you and tried to love it. Not that it ever loved any of us back. That cat hated being touched or even looked at. It didn't hiss or scratch, but God, it would just hide away all day and night. Hard feet for an indoor cat. She lived in the laundry mostly, which was where our toilet was as well. So to get to the toilet, you'd have to sneak past her. I remember one night I woke up suddenly when I opened my eyes in a panic and it was pitch black. You could look back and say perhaps it was a moonless night, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like the darkness had eyes, like it was watching me, covering me, running all over my skin in its thickness. Black so thick it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up on end. It made my mind race, my heart beat in my throat. Any trace of sleep gone, I realized I probably woke up because of the overwhelming need to pee. With absolute dread I got up and walked the 15 steps to the bathroom. I would have got the belt if I'd woken my parents up by turning on the light, and both were light sleepers, so I walked in the dark. I held on to the walls and put one foot in front of the other. Shivers ran up and down my arms. My breath felt heavy in front of my face, even though it was warm inside. I turned, knocked for the cat, and opened the laundry door, only to find the cat upright on its bed, absolutely fixated and hissing at the window in the laundry door. I think I was so stunned that this cat was hissing and angry that I just froze. Dread swept over me like ice over my body. I went hot and cold all over before I could even tell you why. I turned my head, and in that large window was a dark shadow of a huge man with a top hat on. He was looking right at me. I knew he was. Through me. Over me. No features in that thick darkness, but the outline of him was so very clear. The sensation of being bathed in ice down every root of hair, from the top of my head to my toes. The cat was growling and hissing, looking at the same thing as me. I forgot to close the door or to breathe. I just ran into my room and hid under the bed, rocking back and forth for hours until the sun came up, trying to breathe through the terror and fight for control over my thoughts, trying to rationalize with myself. I tried to tell my parents. I really tried to tell them, and they didn't believe me. They said I saw the shadow of the trees moving outside, that it was my imagination. That night on, I made sure to pee before bed, double-checked the security door was locked, that the wooden door was locked, that the blinds in my room were down, and that I had my lamp on. I slept with the light on from then on, and even then I didn't feel safe. 12 years old. My grandparents came to stay with us for the year from overseas. The house was small, so they moved me from my room to the study. I had no complaints. I loved my grandparents a lot. The study was small. I slept on the pull-out sofa. It touched the deck, which had a computer on it. The window was narrow and in a corner, but it was floor to ceiling. This room did not have curtains. My parents also didn't let me take my lamp as my parents needed it to read at night. I tried to ask for it a few times and was told to grow up. It started maybe the night I first slept there or that first week. I can't be sure. That part is fuzzy, so I won't mess around. I'd wake up for no apparent reason in the middle of the night. Once, twice a week at first, then it got to every night. My parents started getting angry with me over it. I was tired and the school was noticing. I'd say it was months that constant night waking happened without cause, though it could have been weeks, when one night it changed. I woke up to hear tapping on the window. It was so soft at first I thought I was dreaming, but every night it got a little louder, very distinct. Sometimes there was long drawn-out scratching, sometimes breathing, heavy breathing, but no matter what, there was always the tapping. I didn't look. I never looked. It seems my fear response is to freeze and hide like a coward, but that tapping and those sounds were terrifying. I would sit in that bed with my head under covers drenched in sweat waiting for it to finish, waiting for the noises to stop, the sickness of fear to leave my body. I'd lose hours trying to gain control of myself. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. My parents were enraged with what I had going on. They told me it was birds, the flowers outside the window hitting in the wind, that I was making things up in my head. By summer, I was a mess. My grandparents even offered for me to sleep in bed with them, but my parents got angry, saying I wasn't a baby and that was ridiculous. It was a hot night. I'll never forget it. It had been a scorcher of a day, and we didn't have air conditioning, just a box in the living room. So my parents got the mattresses and put them on the living room floor for my grandparents and for them to sleep. I got to sleep on the couch with them, and it was the first time in a very long time I got to sleep in. It was such a heavy, healing sleep. When I woke up, I am sure it was afternoon. Maybe the one and only time I was ever allowed to sleep in like that since I was little, and my parents were acting so strange. They made me breakfast in silence, and my grandparents didn't say much. I ate in this weird silence too, and the longer it went, the sicker I felt. Like I had done something really bad and I was about to get a beating. But Dad sat down at the table and started asking me questions. When did I start hearing the noises? What did the man I saw look like, etc. I cannot describe the relief I felt that finally I was being listened to. I went over all of it, again, for the manyth time. The man in the window, the cat hissing, the tapping, the noises, everything. I tried to be as honest as I could. I know when I looked at my dad when I finished that he didn't believe me. He said he heard the tapping at the window last night. They all had. It had woken them all up. My dad had gone outside to look, but no one was there. He said he's thought about it logically, and it must be one of the kids from school pulling a prank, and he'd talk to the school. That night, after a long, hot day, we got this beautiful summer rain. I sat in the garden and got soaked before my parents got home from work. I sat in the garden and enjoyed that water hitting me, washing away all my problems for a minute. That night I was so exhausted that I just fell asleep watching TV. My parents moved me, and groggy as I was, I just fell flat on the sofa bed and passed out. They'd left my window open, my nightlight off. That night I woke up to the sound of my name, my full name being whispered to me. The darkness was thicker than I'd ever felt it before. The voice was inside and outside at the same time, calling my name, enunciating each vowel. I was frozen with fear. I held my hands to my ears. I squeezed my eyes closed so tight I felt my eyes would glue themselves shut. The voice got louder and louder, more demanding, telling me to come to the window, calling my name. That voice wasn't man, woman, or child. There was no describing it, but it knew I was awake. It knew because it became insistent that I come to the window, that I get up and come and look. When it growled at me to come to the window, the voice angry and insistent, something snapped inside of me. I felt like my heart would give out if I didn't open my mouth and say something, do anything, so I screamed. When I tell you I screamed, I mean I screamed so loud that my voice broke. I didn't scream words or help. I just screamed this primal sound like some animal dying. My dad burst into my room and asked me what was going on. I couldn't talk. I couldn't speak. I was just terrified beyond measure. My bed was so wet from sweat that it looked like I'd taken a shower and just lied down without drying. I was allowed to sleep with my grandparents after that, and my parents got security lights and ADT security that they armed every night. They even got the priest to come and bless the house. My parents installed security cameras around every corner outside, all of them capturing the windows and doors to the house. I never heard about it again. All the noises stopped, the darkness gone, the feeling of being watched all the time disappeared too, and I forgot about it. Friends and life and fun taking over those memories. I did ask my dad about it years ago. I think I'd had a bad dream. I must have been in my late teens. He looked startled I'd brought it up. He told me not to worry about it anymore. But the look on his face was haunted. Whatever actually happened, whatever he knew, he's taking it to the grave. They say if you practice law long enough, eventually you'll find the case that'll break you. Well, I've only been in practice for a few years, but I already found mine. The type of case that places not only your mind and body in peril, but your soul itself, if you believe in such a thing. It all started about a week ago, when I was assigned the representation of one Turner Dunn, an elementary school custodian accused of slaughtering 3 people here in rural Pennsylvania. I'm going to stick with people for purposes of this account, though my subsequent investigation calls that designation into question. What I'll say for now is that the victims are no longer in their graves, and I'll leave it at that. They were corrupted, is how Turner himself plainly described it. I had to eliminate them. They were taking over the whole town. That's what he'd said the first time I visited him at the tiny county jail, where murderers get mixed in with drunken brawlers, spousal abusers, and small-time drug dealers before they are processed through the state and sent their separate ways. I was assigned the case in my role as local public defender. Said another way, Turner couldn't afford a private lawyer, so he was assigned to me. Knowing what I know now, I do believe he assaulted 3 individuals, though I do not believe he had the necessary mens rea to commit the crime. Plus, murder requires, actually killing someone. Turner told me that he'd served as a night janitor at, let's call it G Elementary School, graduating from a high school in the mid-90s. He described himself as a loner, someone who preferred working in the shadows. He described the night of the massacre as follows. He was working the night shift when he decided to hoof it to a local 24-hour convenience store to buy a pack of smokes and a cup of coffee. This was a normal routine for Turner, or at least had been since he'd lost his car in his divorce. Not to my wife, he had explained. To my divorce lawyer, only way I could afford her. Turner said he had planned to walk to a store outside town limits on this particular night. I already knew then that plenty of people weren't acting right, he explained. Something foul was in the air. Even the children were acting different when I worked the day shift. It's like they weren't even kids anymore. He said he locked up the school at around 3 a.m. and cut through the town's church graveyard to the way out of town. Something that he said he didn't find creepy because he'd done it so often, and because he was used to being alone at night given his line of work. Like a vampire, he said he preferred the night. When he reached the entrance of the graveyard, he heard a loud, shrieking sound. At first he thought it was a coyote, or some other type of nocturnal creature, but he could soon make out a woman's voice screaming, "I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. Let me go." Turner said he next heard another voice, a deep male one that sounded almost inhuman. "You offered to spill the blood," the voice said, "to walk forever with your daughter. There's no going back now." At least, that's what my case notes say. Not that I believed Turner's story when he first told me all this. Turner claimed he then rushed toward the voices, where he heard 3 locals crouching over a 30-ish woman, a local teacher. The aggressors were the town's mail carrier, the middle school's bus driver, and a Catholic priest. I know it sounds like the build-up to a joke, right? Turner said it seemed the priest was in charge, as he held a long, sharp caesar blade in his hand. One of them had already slit her throat, and were allowing the blood to drip into a chalice-like cup held up by the bus driver, a local named Pam Harper. "To Eden," the mail carrier said. "The return to Eden," the priest countered. They apparently took turns drinking from the chalice, and the priest chided the bus driver. "Make sure you save some for the master. You know we must tithe." Holding the whimpering woman down, they began to bite at her bare skin, drawing blood and sucking it up as though they were leeches. "It was disturbing as hell," Turner said, fidgeting in his seat, something fierce. "My God, it was evil. Evil in its purest form. And I don't need my notes to recall that much. I can still remember Turner's disgusted face as he said it. The way his fingers gently traced the jail library books that were set out before him on the rickety wooden table. So I did what any rational person would do," Turner said. "I pulled out the little handgun I kept with me. Should anyone sneak into the school at night, and I blasted them suckers." "Literally suckers?" I said, but Turner wasn't amused. "Don't tell me you've never dealt with the occult before," he said, grimly serious. "Practicing out here in the sticks?" "Oh, the odd ritualistic murder or two," I said. "But literal vampires? No, that would be a first." "These weren't vampires," Turner said. "At least I don't think. Not yet. Anyway, more like vampires' helpers." I asked Turner how, if this was all true, the woman who had been sliced open had communicated an entirely different story. "You are aware that Stephanie Daniels told the police she was performing a prayer for her deceased daughter when you came out of nowhere, guns a-blazing?" "Yes," Turner had said. "Of course I know what she said, and I know how it looks, but something must have changed in her by the time I flagged down the county sheriff. Whoever or whatever else was waiting out there must have speeded up her transformation." He claimed it wouldn't be the first time that his tiny town had been slowly converted into a town of monsters. Vampires, or something vampire-like to be precise. He described chronic absenteeism at school and work, abrupt personality changes, strange disappearances and reappearances, missing bodies, desecrated graves. I asked him why he didn't inform law enforcement before the night of the so-called massacre, and he insisted that the local police were among the first to be converted, and at any rate, he didn't think any other law enforcement would believe the conspiracies of some middle-aged janitor. Said that half the time he had a hard time believing it himself. Unless you're trying to plead insanity, I had told him. Your story isn't going to go over very well with a jury of your peers. It was, unbelievably, the craziest story I had ever heard. In a long career of crazy stories. Totally and utterly unhinged. Go there, he insisted. Go to the town yourself and see, if you really think I'm a nut. Then his eyes grew wide with fear. But if you do, counselor, then by God, bring along a posse, some fresh garlic, and some mighty sharp wooden stakes. Your laws will mean nothing out there. The next day I went to G alone, sans posse, garlic, or stakes. Us public defenders don't exactly have the budget for posses. Besides, I had been practicing long enough to give little credit to paranoid delusions. Sometimes people just break. It isn't really their fault, but it's not necessarily my job to believe them, just to help them as best I can with the limited tools at my disposal. That's how I saw it anyway back then. The first odd thing I noticed, as I drove up a gravel street toward the center of town, was how quiet it was. Describing something as eerily quiet seems like a cliche, and I suppose it is, but that's the best way I can describe what I witnessed. A dead zone, a broken promise of a place. The first thing I did was stop at the local police station. It was an old building, apparently one that used to be the public library, based on the fading letters that adorned its white brick exterior. There was no receptionist, so I shouted, "Hello?" as I stood in the worn-out, 70s shag carpeted lobby. An officer appeared a minute later, wearing dark sunglasses indoors. His skin was an icky greenish shade. I assumed he was jaundiced from liver failure. The cops and the sticks know how to party with the best of 'em. "You're not from around here," the officer said, though it was more of a statement than a question. "Are you, son?" His voice was slimy sounding, oozy. I explained the situation, and I soon had his full attention, though perhaps for the wrong reasons. "Are you alone?" he had asked, his eyes constantly darting around the room. "I'm with some others," I lied. "I can show you around the town, help you make the right connections," the officer said, "but it will have to be tonight." He forced a brackish smile. "Paperwork," he explained. I noticed that the notepad poking out of his uniform was stained the blackish red of dried blood. "I'll come back later," I lied. "Around sundown?" The officer asked me to wait a moment before I left, but by then I was already backpedaling out of the station, unnerved, bordering on utterly creeped out. As I exited, I swore I heard whispering from the hallway behind me. "He knows," was what the whispering sounded like. "He knows." By then I felt more than a bit jittery, if not outright fearful, but I decided to carry on with my investigation. It's not that I'm particularly brave, just that I've seen a lot of strange things in my job. I don't have the energy to get into it now, but needless to say, public defenders deal with all kinds. I say this because I'm sure you now doubt the veracity of this tale, as I originally doubted Turner Dunn's. But maybe this world is a bit weirder than we've been given to believe. Despite my unease, I decided to visit Stephanie Daniels, the woman who apparently came back from the dead, or at the very least recovered from a slit throat in record timing. She lived, or perhaps now it was unlived, in an old Victorian off Main Street. I parked outside the house, noticing how all its windows appeared to be sealed off, boarded up. Heavy black curtains, like the kind that, yes, a vampire might use to keep out the sun. I noticed a familiar effect in some of the other local houses, as though G were an Alaskan town besieged by 24-hour daylight. rather than just another rural community in good old Pennsylvania. I sat in front of the house for a while, stalling. I felt some strange malevolence in the town generally, but something felt more specifically off about this house. I tried to check my emails, hoping to buy some time, but I had no reception. A not uncommon issue where we live, and having nothing to do with the supernatural or occult, or so I assume. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, though the streets were quiet. No children, jumping rope, no old men tending to their lawns with desperate precision. Not even any cars around, save the ones scattered about, parked like lumpy glacier rocks. I got out of my old Ford F-150 and made my way outside. The sun was still bright and high in the sky, and I felt embarrassed that I took comfort in that fact. I climbed up a few porch steps, which were as soft as butter, and inched my way to the front door. I knocked 3 times and then rang the doorbell for good measure. Then I waited and waited, but nobody answered. In the driveway was a freshly polished green Subaru. I walked around the back of the house to find a clothesline stuffed with bed sheets and clothes stained a blackish red. I tried the front door again with no answer, and with a morbid sensation of fear gripping me, made my way back to my truck. A few moments later, I was turning onto Main Street when another truck crashed into the passenger side of my vehicle at full impact. No airbag went off because my truck was too old for such safety measures. A true classic, and if you've ever heard the saying, they don't make 'em like they used to, then that might very well be true. The newer truck that had crashed into me crinkled in on itself like a sardine can, whereas my Ford screeched a loud clang and was simply brought to rest in a slow-motion puff of unleashed hood steam. Wiping some blood from my brow, my head had struck the steering wheel, but I felt generally okay, aside from a bloody nose. It didn't feel broken, just slightly mangled. A dripper rather than a gusher. As I made my way to check the other driver, I noticed it was a priest, or at the very least, someone wearing the priest garb. "I'm so sorry," the priest said, in what was indeed an inhuman-sounding voice. "I simply wasn't paying attention. I didn't even see you there." "Are you okay?" I asked. I noticed that his head looked positively bashed in, and yet he was not bleeding. His skin looked dry and drained. His right eye was all but detached, and yet he acted as though he had suffered a paper cut. "I am perfectly fine, my son," the priest said, "but we better call the police." "More like an ambulance," I said. "Stay still and don't move." I didn't want him to make anything worse. The priest kept playing with something in his seat. When I leaned over, I saw what it was. He was attempting to reattach his right arm, which had been severed in the accident, only there was no blood at all. "You're not bleeding," I said, as much to myself as him. "Why, of course I am," the priest said. "Bleeding all over. Why, you must have suffered a concussion. Now hold on while I call the police. I think you need medical assistance." But by then, I already saw a police cruiser rushing toward us. I looked to the bloodless priest, then to the jaundiced-eyed face of the officer I had just spoken with, and then I gathered my briefcase tight to my body and bolted away. "He knows," hissed the priest in that inhuman voice. "Get after him, Bill. By Christ, he knows." And now, though I wish to continue my story, my head is throbbing and I can't possibly get any more words typed out. I am so sorry to leave you in media res, but I need to take a nap before I can go. I will check back soon to continue with what happened next. I promise, and assuming I'm still all here, I'm just so weak from all that transpired, and my body must rest for now. So there I was, stuck in G with no ride, no friends, and the sinking suspicion that my client Turner Dunn was right. This town really was being taken over by bloodthirsty vampires. How else to explain the priest's severed arm producing no blood? The uneasiness of the jaundiced police officer who insisted we meet again at night. The bloody clothes that hung like battered piñatas from Stephanie Daniels' clothesline. It seemed that G had all at once become a dry town, and I don't mean they were no longer serving alcohol. But as I tripped and slid through the high reeds of an open sewer creek, taking in the reek of raw sewage through my busted nose, I couldn't help but consider things how a judge or jury might. After all, I had now fled the scene of an accident. Worse yet, had sprinted away from the police cruiser as though I had done something wrong. I've seen people get booked for much less, especially in our not-so-just justice system. I had to table such thoughts, piker that I was, because at that moment I heard a whispering shh from inside a nearby tunnel. One of those open-faced sewer tunnels where you can imagine uncanny alligators might reside until you remember you're in northeast Appalachia. "Go on," I said to the faceless voice from inside that dark void. "If you're going to kill me, just do it already." "I'm not going to kill you," came a tiny voice. "But if you don't hide in here, the others might." I trundled to the crevice and peered in. A child stood before me, his face partially subsumed by dwindling light. No more than 10 or 11 from the look of it. A worn Yankees cap slicked across his greasy hair, and his eyes seemed to glow with feline intensity. "Are you a vampire?" I asked. "Because you're sure lurking in the shadows like one." "Hard to hide in the light, mister," the voice murmured. "And who said anything about vampires?" This made me feel a bit better. Perhaps I had misjudged the town after all, had slid right off old Occam's razor and straight into La La Land, bleeding all the way. I didn't exactly have gray in my beard yet, but I thought I'd been practicing long enough to no longer get wrapped up in my client's delusions. Yet here I was. "Of course there's no vampires," I said, pinching at my nose, almost believing it. "I know," the child said. "They're zombie witches." The thing about this new generation is they're apparently misinformed when it comes to monster tropes. My parents' generation had learned that vampires were to be feared, and my generation had learned that they were to be screwed. But apparently these pandemic babies didn't know anything from their elbow when it came to basic vampire lore. "They, eat people," the child said. By then I had learned his name was Reggie, which means they're zombies. But they also chant strange, witchy things. So I think that makes them zombie witches. "But vampires eat people too," I said. "Or more specifically, suck their blood." "Whatever," Reggie said, leaning against the sewer walls, becoming one with that true bacterial fantasia. "All I know is they bit my parents, and then my parents wanted to bite me." He looked up at me as though I were the dumbest human on the planet, and maybe he wasn't far off. "Zombies," he said definitively. From what I gathered, Reggie and his family resided in a local trailer park. His mother worked at the diner waiting tables, and his father was an angry, bitter man even before he made his little pact with the Dark Lord. Reggie had a half-sister who had recently been taken away by Child Protective Services, and one can assume it was all for the better. A world where vampires were real and Child Protective Services were competent. I really had gone through the looking glass. Being tiny and resilient, if not intelligent about suddenly life-defining monster tropes, Reggie had apparently spent the past few days farting around in the sewer system. Something he apparently also did before his town grew some teeth. I offered him an old banana from my briefcase and my deepest condolences. "How do you know I'm not a zombie witch?" I asked. "Simple," he replied. "You haven't tried to eat me yet, and that's how you know I ain't one either." I asked Reggie if he knew Turner Dunn, and he said he did, but everyone in school called him Turdler because he was always cleaning toilets. He said the kids hated him because he was always in a foul mood, pushing his mop around, tripping children with gleeful hate in his eyes, and so on. I asked Reggie if there were any other humans left, and he said maybe there was and maybe there wasn't, but he wasn't much inclined to find out. He asked me if I had a plan, and I said we should hide in the sewer system and wait things out. This didn't impress Reggie much, that my plans were apparently no better than his own despite our decided age difference. Reggie said we would have to hoof it to a nearby stream if we were going to have anything to drink, and it was better to do it by light of day. Having no better options, I started to follow the fleet-footed little guy, struggling to keep up. I never much liked children, not even when I was a child myself, but I was out of ideas and, like the vampires, increasingly thirsty. As we walked, I noticed the child left no reflection in the water. I seemed to recall something about reflections in vampires, but then settled on that being in photographs. By then I was feeling a bit groggy from the head trauma, and the boy was too fast to get a good look, so I kept following. We eventually came upon a stream, though it wasn't apparent that its source was any different from the sewer. I didn't want to explain the contours of my germophobia to the child, who was already on his hands and knees scooping the water to his mouth, so I just hung back. "Come on," he said. "It tastes good." I told him that so did chocolate to dogs, but that didn't mean it wasn't poisonous, but he kept gulping away. The banana I had given him was still in his pocket. I would have assumed he'd have scarfed it down straight away. I felt a twinge of fear shivering up my spine, and then I felt like a giant dork for fearing a 90-pound child. If I had a significant other, I thought, they would really be embarrassed at how hollow I was feeling. I walked toward the boy to see if I could make out a reflection. Then he wheeled around on me and started slurping up the blood from my nose. I pushed him off me and stared in disbelief as Reggie, or what used to be Reggie, licked my blood from his fingers. I hadn't noticed before how green he looked in the light. "I can't bite," Reggie said. "My big teeth haven't grown in yet. I can only drink the blood of lamb." "So I suppose that makes you a zombie witch?" I asked. "No," Reggie said. "You were right all along. I'm a vampire." He started screaming, "He's here! He's here!" My heart racing with fear, I flung little Reggie into the stream and cut my way up and away from the water, darting through old-growth forest and wishing I'd kept up with my law school cardio routine. "He's getting away!" Reggie screamed behind me. By then I was inexplicably back in Stephanie Daniels' backyard. Unless there happened to be another Victorian with blood-stained clotheslines. And in this town, I couldn't exactly rule that out. I climbed in through a basement window and slinked my way into a crawl space. There, I tried my phone again, but it still had no reception, and was also running distressingly low on battery. I used the flashlight app and saw that the basement looked like a kid's playroom had just exploded. Stuffies and dollhouses and even a tiny porcelain white crib. There was also a coffin-shaped pine box that I dared not open, one too large for a child of normal proportions. Everything else seemed right out of a nursery. That's right, I suddenly remembered. Stephanie Daniels had wanted to join the Vampy cult so she could be with her dead daughter. Turner had said the Vampy crew had been meeting at her daughter's gravesite. The police report indicated the child had died a couple years earlier from severe pneumonia. I tell you, there's evil in this world to the microscopic level. These thoughts were interrupted by a creaking sound upstairs, that of a chair rocking. I tiptoed my way to the top of the stairs and found the basement door cracked ajar, just an inch. Outside in the living room, I could make out Stephanie Daniels. I recognized her from the case file photos. Rocking a pale toddler, in her hand was a clear baby bottle from which she was feeding to the child. The baby bottle was filled not with milk or formula, but with a black red blood. The child sucked on the nub of the bottle greedily, hissing and writhing in delight. She was all but a skeleton. I'm not sure what type of curse gave her human form at all. By any normal biology, the child should have been nothing more than a skeleton sporting a creepy tuft of hair. Stephanie was humming some mesmeric-sounding nursery song. I didn't recognize the tune. Perhaps the vampires have their own music catalog. Stephanie cooed, a cursed chant to my ears. Across her neck was a long, blistering, fresh scar. Turner was right. She had been stabbed. How had the county sheriff missed that? The report indicated Stephanie had no signs of lesions or trauma of any kind. It must have been my weariness. I'm not sure what else could have done it, as I'm really not one for a death wish, but at that moment I swayed ever so gently and bumped my still bleeding nose against the basement door. Immediately Stephanie's eyes darted to the door jamb, and my stupid face. I didn't know we had a visitor, she said to the child. She spoke with the soothing yet creepy voice of a dental hygienist, about to dig into an inflamed gum. May I please ask what you're doing in our house? She said. I pushed open the basement door, more out of curiosity than any latent bravery. For Christ's sake, I said, pointing to the bottle. You've made an abomination of your daughter. For Satan's sake, she said. You've made an abomination of yourself. Stephanie Daniels, or what had become of her, strapped on one of those icky baby carriers that go around one's shoulder to keep the hands free. She took her time in doing so. Meanwhile, Skella Baby slurped at that bottle, which she now held tightly in her own desecrated little claws. I don't believe we met, Stephanie said. And even if we did, I doubt you'd recognize me now. It's been a busy few days, hasn't it, little Aurora? She said to her daughter. She stared up at me and winked, a soulless facial twitch from her gaunt face. I'm a lawyer, I said as though I owed her an explanation, and I felt in a way that I did, having broken into her house. She giggled. A lawyer? She repeated. Then come join us. Clearly you're meant to play for our side. She moved toward me and I flashed my cell phone at her, flashlight app blazing. She screamed, turning away at my steel attack, but laughing too, as though at the ridiculous of it all. That's when my cell phone died. She lunged at me, and this time I tripped over my own shoes and fell down the flight of hard, gray basement steps. She laughed at the top of the stairs as though this was mere theater. A Saturday Night Live cast member throwing themselves over a cardboard sofa. Despite the fall, I wasn't in very much pain. I'd sort of caught myself against the railing a few times on the tumble, and one strength I've always had is I'm quite hard-headed. I laid in a messy heap at the bottom of the stairs. Then I gathered myself together and slipped out the window I had entered back into the purifying light of a now descending sun, rosy red, glimmering. There's hope in the sun, even if it's capable of burning our eyes out. As I ran away, I could hear Stephanie and little Aurora screaming into the basement and tearing their way through the dead nursery. I didn't wait for them to see I'd escaped. But I write these words while lightly sedated at a local hospital. I'm gathering my strength to tell my story in full, considering one last attempt to prove that neither Turner Dunn nor I suffer from any form of hysteria. You'd been in a car accident, the sheriff said. You fell down a flight of stairs. Of course your ability to discern reality is somewhat impeded. I still want to continue with what happened, but as before, the telling makes me weary, as the various meds act and counteract in my system and the nurses come and go, checking my vital signs and working to ensure I don't try another jailbreak. Before, I could go on and on typing. A laptop is any good lawyer's weapon of choice, but I fear this is where my fingers must stop their typing. For now. Toward the end of my first meeting with Turner Dunn, he told me that being attacked by vampires wasn't the worst thing that happened to him during his ordeal. It was not being believed by regular old humans that really got to him. The way you're looking at me right now, he had said, as though I'm crazy, when I know that I'm not. And now I can relate. As I sit here in the hospital being watched over with dutiful indifference, as though I'm some lonely senior in a nursing home. But I digress, and I don't have time to digress. I have to get out of here. I need to get back to G with garlic and steaks, like I should have done the first time. I just need to allow the sedation to wear off, and in the meantime write this out so everyone knows what's going on. As I was saying before I drifted off, I had escaped from Stephanie Daniels' house, and was leaving her and her vampy Skelebaby behind when I saw the police cruiser turn the corner. Gunshots blasted against the cruiser from one of the boarded up houses, but everyone knows guns have no effect on vampires. All it did was help to slow down the cruiser some, and give me hope that the town had not yet turned 100%. Across the street I could see the priest walking about, carrying his own right hand as though it were a mallet. The white band of his Roman collar was now stained a deep shade of scarlet. I was walking about in some sort of stupor, my nose bleeding and my legs failing from my fall down the cellar stairs. Behind me, Stephanie Daniels appeared on her front porch, Skelebaby still in its carrier, holding its blood bottle close, as a mantis does its decapitated lover. My body writhed in panicked fear. Hopeless. Hopeless. Counselor, the jaundiced cop said, stepping out of his parked cruiser. It would appear you've been breaking some of our rules. He took out his citation book. Whoever was shooting from the boarded-up house lit the officer up with a spray of bullets, but no blood was forthcoming from the cop, who merely shook like a wet dog. Old Lady Wilcox, he told Stephanie, as though they were ordering an office lunch. We'll take care of her next. I looked up at the magnificent sun as it descended behind the surrounding hills and cast its final rays of dying light upon the desecrated mountain town. I was surrounded and much too tired and slow to make another run for it. I would have to use the only tool I've ever had, the power of persuasion. Listen, I'm only here because I'm Turner Dunn's court-appointed public defender, I said. He was saying some crazy stuff about this place, so I wanted to investigate, but now I know he was lying. I continued, because obviously this place is far more messed up than he let on. The master was a barrister once, the officer said in an even tone. In a former life, so to speak. London. I sat down on the curb, allowed my new companion's hungry eyes to take me in. I saw them lick their chops at the sight of the blood still dripping from my nose. Maybe it was broken after all. I awaited the onslaught, saying a silent prayer to a god I only half believed in. "What is it you want?" I asked. "World domination? To simply be left alone? Clean air, fresh food, so to speak?" This was Negotiation 101. Attempt to see the matter from the other side's point of view. It was really no different from negotiating with a district attorney. As I spoke, I tried my best not to shake in desperate fear. I felt that at any moment, one of the unearthed ones might snap at me like a hungry animal, tear at my soft lawyer skin, and rip out my vocal cords. But they didn't. They explained that all they really wanted was a tiny town they could fully control, one that allowed them to not be hunted, and provide decent food options from local metro areas. They didn't want there to be too many vampires, mind you, because that led to competition, but they needed full control of a town so that it could appear to function normally. G just fit the bill. They were tired of living in the shadows, so to speak. "We're really close to Pittsburgh here, to Scranton, to Philadelphia," the priest explained. "And if someone goes missing from one of those places, then nobody really notices. It's just a statistic, not a big deal." "Understood," I said as though I were a worldly realtor, weighing the pros and cons of purchasing a new condo. "Never go to the bathroom where you eat, right? Makes perfect sense." Next, I decided to find their negotiating pain points. "Listen," I explained. "My colleagues know that I'm here. If I go missing, then 2 people like me are going to show up, and then 4, then 8. And that might make for easy meals for a little while, but eventually it's going to draw a giant X on this place. But if you let me go, then I promise I'll never say a word about this town's little secret. I get to live, you get to live in peace in your beautiful little town. It's a win-win deal." "And you'll plead your client to insanity, I presume?" asked a new voice, the head honcho himself. "Dracula. Or whatever our modern-day equivalent of Dracula is." This dude wasn't wearing a cape or anything. He just looked timelessly awesome. He walked with a crystal vanity cane, and he was wearing one of those 50s-style hats, though I'm not sure which century's 50s exactly. He was sipping a Manhattan made out of fresh blood from a gold-rimmed martini glass. Somebody's blue eyeball was floating in it as a garnish. Oh, and he had the coolest pair of vintage sunglasses you'd ever hope to see in the world. This was a vampire who understood both style and irony. "Master," said the others in unison. Well, except the Skella baby. Skella baby was incapable of doing anything more than hissing or cooing, though it apparently far preferred the former. "The barrister," I said, mock bowing. He explained that he had heard my proposal, and that he found my predicament most interesting. "But what assurance do we have that you wouldn't open your flabby mouth?" I sat down, shaking in fear, my mind sharp with thoughts. And then it came to me, an idea so stupid, so lawyerly, that it might just work. "I'll sign you up as clients," I said. Then I can't repeat what I saw because of the attorney-client privilege. "I don't think that's quite how it works," the barrister said. But then he admitted it had been more than a century since he'd last practiced law. Apparently, he mostly dabbled in real estate and mayhem these days. In time, I had drawn up a contract, and we all signed in counterpart, as us lawyers say. though they wouldn't let me have my copy. The barrister promised me that if I went back on the offer at all, he would have me and everyone I cared about murdered in the most grim manner possible. I joked that as a lawyer, I only really cared about myself. We'll see. Perhaps, the barrister's son. We'll see if that's so true. Sorry about your truck, the priest said, after the contract had been executed. By then, the vampires were all drinking the blood of Wilcox, and they had given me some boxed wine. I had insisted on white for obvious reasons. No worries, I told the priest. And, sorry about your hand getting severed. The good news is it doesn't hurt, the priest said. Not one bit. After that, everyone was in a much better mood. We spent the night playing Pinnacle while the vampires debated global warming, proper skincare, and whether doe or buck blood tasted closer to human when they were hard up for food. I mostly focused on my card hands. That's not to say either side passed the evening without trepidations. There was more side-eyeing and paranoia than a Tarantino film. They loved to discuss heretical topics and seemed ready to fly into a frenzy at any moment my blood pushed the fresh blood. With all that said, considering the company I generally keep is other lawyers, I've had worse evenings. Before sunrise, the friendly local vampire mechanic had repaired my truck and I was sent on my way home, where I immediately checked into a hospital and ranted and raved about all that I had seen. You really didn't think I was going to honor my attorney-client pact with that village of bloodsuckers, did you? But though I've tried to keep a light tone in this retelling, earlier today I had some sad and discomforting news. Turner Dunn had apparently hung himself with his bedsheets last night in prison, and I can't help but think it was an inside job. If you catch my morphine-dripped drift, nobody believed Turner until it was too late. What's wrong with our species? We never believe anything or anyone until it's too late. There's a nurse now, knocking at my curtain. Can one knock at a curtain? You know what I mean. She's letting in the county sheriff. He has a wolf-like face and surprisingly large incisors. He's telling me he wants a minute alone to talk. He says I need to put down my laptop now to talk. He says to trust him. Says this will take but a minute. I found the journal of Harold Upkiss, wrapped in an old plastic carrier bag, rested in a drainage tunnel buried under a bank of sand. He had been missing for 35 years, and I had finally found out why. My crew had been assigned to a copse of trees surrounded by farmers' fields known locally as Sandbank to install new drainage channels to prevent flooding, a common problem in the fenlands surrounding Wisbech. Back in the 80s, this became a sudden dumping ground for tons of sand which smothered the small woodland, and the area got fenced off as a local hazard. The government restricted the land for 40 years before giving it up to the local council. Aside from the drainage problems, it was merely a local oddity, an irrelevance. While digging out the sand around the edge of the copse, we discovered a large, corrugated metal pipe. We pulled the tunnel out with a digger, and the top just shattered, brittle with rust. Sat on top of a thick stew of mud which half filled the pipe was a white and blue tattered carrier bag. It pulled apart like tissue paper, and inside was a brown leather-bound book. Written on the front in thick black pen was, Journal of Harold Upkiss. Do not touch. I ignored his warning and flicked through the pages, scanning through towards the final entry. The journal documented his daily routine. Every meal had been meticulously noted and reviewed, no matter how mundane. He would log the weather, what he wore, who he spoke to, and where he went with his friends. Other than the fact he was logging at all, it was a fairly normal routine for a boy of 13. I read the last entry to see what led to the journal being out here. After a normal day, he experienced something unusual. Journal entry, 13th of July, 1988. Approximately 4 p.m., out in the fields with Michael P. and David C. Michael had made a bow and arrow from an old bullwhip he had found. He stripped off the leather binding, exposing a flexible plastic core. He managed to attach a string and whittled some arrows out of sticks. We gathered feathers as flights. It was fun until Michael stopped shooting across the field and aimed the bow straight up in the sky. He let loose and the arrow disappeared into the sky. Michael ran. David and I scrambled randomly. The arrow thumped into the dirt 20 feet away from me. "What are you doing?" David asked, half angry, yet the sudden excitement fueled maniacal laughter. Michael shrugged. "Chances are it wasn't going to hit any of us." "You're mental," David replied. For a moment I thought David was going to thump him, but he just picked up some of the arrows that were stuck in the ground, snapped them over his knee, and walked off home. Michael was furious and ran up behind David, brandishing the bow like a club. David ran ahead. Michael then stopped and searched his backpack. He pulled out an arrow and got ready to aim it at David until I shouted out. Michael paused, lowered the bow, then calmly asked me, "Want to make some more arrows?" "Not really," I said. Michael replied, "I've got some more spares anyway." Evening was closing in, so we started heading back for our street. I stopped and sat at a short wall by the old barn to update my journal, which annoyed Michael. He always thought I was documenting evidence against him. "Maybe I am," I'd reply, but he would always wait for me. While we were sitting there, I heard a whining, metallic screeching sound overhead, then a flash of blinding bright lights. I didn't see anything, but felt a tremor pass through the ground. Up the wall, enough to make my butt numb. Then came a rain of dirt. I shielded my head with my backpack for a few seconds until it stopped. Then I finally looked at Michael. "What was that?" I asked. Michael was as confused as me, but he pointed over towards the copse. One large tree, I think it's an ash tree, was broken and splintered, and it looked like steam was rising from amongst the trees. Michael started walking straight over to it. Without a word, I followed. When we got to the copse, I heard hissing sounds. Then it became a violent buzzing, electrical sound as if a loose cable was zapping erratically like an enraged snake. We went to enter the copse over one of the drainage ditches, but as Michael reached the crest on the far side, he ducked down. "Watch it," he said. "Something's there." "What?" I whispered back. Michael turned back and followed the ditch around to an old tunnel all the kids in the area knew as a good hiding spot. It was overgrown with brambles at the entrance, but was a trail was worn away by wildlife. Badgers, I guessed. The tunnel was too small for deer as it was almost half filled with dirt, but there wasn't enough room for us to get through on our knees. Michael crawled up the tunnel, and I followed. When we got towards the end of the tunnel, where the land suddenly slopes upwards to join the copse, Michael took out his bow and pulled 3 arrows from his backpack. I had no idea why. He had one ready to shoot as he emerged from the edge of the tunnel and looked over the earth slope. I pulled myself up alongside him and saw the cranage of trees. snapped and splintered by whatever had crashed here. At the base of the tree was wreckage. A small aircraft of some kind, I assume, but there were no wings I could see. It was a shell of dark metal about the size of a car. Some small pieces of debris were scattered around the ground. It appeared to be a completely smooth shell, as I couldn't see any sort of joints or gaps in the bodywork. But suddenly a panel that was seamless then moved out and folded downwards like a small door. Though too small for a grown man, inside something moved, but I didn't see what. We both ducked out of sight. I looked at Michael and saw he was holding something metal. He held it out proudly. It was a curved, triangular piece of dark gray metal, thicker at one end, and it didn't show any sign of damage. When he handed it to me, it seemed impossibly light, as if I was holding a piece of paper. Yet, even at its thinnest point, it felt incredibly strong. It also felt warm on my skin. Not like it was hot, but as if a chili pepper was rubbed against my skin. It felt like a tingling sensation. Michael snatched it back quickly. I went up for another look, but didn't see any movement. The door, or hatch, was still open. The hiss of steam was getting quieter, and the electrical zaps were getting less frequent, but still loud. Every so often the electrical sound randomly cracked like a whip, making us both duck for cover in the pipe. Then the trucks came. Out of the first truck, a man got out and shouted, "It's here, we've got it." Then others followed. It was impossible to tell how many. The sound of their idling diesel engines made the tunnel a cacophony of noise. We both froze in place. "We should go out," I said. "Are you stupid?" Michael said. "We've seen something we shouldn't have. Something top secret. Something alien. If we come crawling out, they're not taking us home. They'll lock us up. That's if we're lucky. If it's the army, they could shoot us." I didn't know if he was right, but I had seen the news stories from Northern Ireland. If they justified a shoot-to-kill policy there, then maybe they would do that for whatever was happening here. So we waited. I started to feel sick. I didn't know if it was the mix of nerves and excitement, or just sitting for a prolonged period in this damp drainage tunnel, but I was nauseous. My mind was foggy and every movement ached. Michael was looking sick too, though he didn't say anything. He was breathing heavily and looking pale in the fading light of the tunnel. He coughed at one point and blamed the diesel fumes from the vehicles above. Evening was setting in. Michael took a torch from his backpack. He told me he often snuck out alone at night. Occasionally he flicked the torch on to look at the piece of metal he had found. He looked at it in awe. He barely spoke to me other than when he was thinking out loud. "I wonder what I've got," he would say. Or, "What is it I've found?" He seemed convinced it was part of an alien spaceship, and that he had something incredibly valuable. At one point Michael needed to take a piss, and he did so with not a thought as to where it would end up. The golden stream crept towards me, and I had to arch my body like a startled cat to avoid it. He found this hilarious, stifling his laughter only to avoid being heard by the men above. Soon his attention went back to the spaceship fragment, as he called it. Then the thunder started, and the rain followed. A gentle stream filled the bottom of the ditch and ran into the drainage tunnel, turning the dusty, loose soil into a thick black mud. Water crept in until the mud was unavoidable, covering the floor of the whole tunnel. Above us I could hear a lot of heavy vehicles moving. There was a lot of chatter between what we assumed were soldiers. One thing I heard amidst the noise was that those soldiers were being rotated away from the crash site every 30 minutes or so. After the longest period of heavy machinery, shouting, and metal clinking noises, there was relative quiet. We were waiting for our chance to escape when some other machines then rumbled overhead. We stayed put. A diesel engine rattled and revved occasionally, then we heard some shouting, then a loud metal clattering, and what sounded like a sudden downpour of rain. Only it wasn't rain. It was sand. We saw some flowing down the slope on the cop side of the tunnel. It started as a trickle, but then whatever was pouring the sand moved towards us, and it was enough to cause us to move away from that end of the tunnel. I said, "We've got to go." And Michael nodded. I made my way down the tunnel first, but the rainfall had made the mud into a quagmire. It was difficult to move anyway while feeling so nauseous, but then my feet got bogged down and my knees got sucked into the mud like a vacuum. I put all my effort into driving forwards until I got exhausted, and I had barely moved an inch. I was stuck, only able to get my hands free with barely enough room to kneel upright. Michael had the idea of throwing sand on the mud to try to make it more firm, but it did nothing but add a crust to its surface. Michael looked down the tunnel and began to panic. I urged him not to try and crawl past me and get stuck too, so he didn't. Instead, he pushed me down, forcing me face down in the mud, and used my body as a bridge to get further down the tunnel. When I looked ahead, I saw what caused his panic. More sand began to trickle down on the other side of the tunnel. As he climbed over me, I grabbed at him, hoping he would drag me out of the mud, but he didn't. He tried to shrug me off and keep going. When he had his feet on my shoulders, he tried to jump as far forward as he could, but I grabbed his ankle in the hope he would pull me forward with him. He fell short on his jump and kicked out at me to shake me off. I asked what he was doing, but he didn't respond. He just didn't care. I wanted out of the tunnel and I was slowing him down. I was irrelevant to him, just like when he shot that arrow right up in the air. I was there for his amusement, and now that purpose had ended. He was kicking like a donkey at my arm, and eventually, with hands coated in mud, I lost my grip. I managed to reach over and grab a strap of his backpack. He squirmed loose, slipping the straps off his shoulders, then started shouting, "No, you can't have it. It's mine." I didn't even realize what he was talking about, but when I grabbed the backpack out of instinct, he thought I was trying to steal his piece of metal. "It's mine," he screamed. He kicked at me furiously while pulling on the backpack. The bag tore open, and all the belongings poured out. He dived into the mud to grab the piece of spaceship, which, when pulled out of the mud, somehow remained clean, and mud just dripped off it. Michael pulled back with a smile on his face. He looked me in the eye and said, "Screw you, Harry. Write that in your journal." Further down the tunnel, the mud was more diluted, and Michael was able to trudge his way through. Out of the end of the tunnel, under the increasingly heavy shower of sand. Once out of the tunnel, Michael stumbled, then ran out of sight. The darkness grew in the tunnel, a combination of the failing evening sun and the pouring sand making a veil over the only remaining opening. Any hope Michael might get me help faded quickly. I wish David was here. He would have stopped Michael. He would have helped me. My one piece of fortune was that with the clutter from Michael's bag, I got his torch. It is by the light of my torch that I write this journal now. Both ends of the tunnel are covered in sand. I shouted for hours. I screamed for help. It's agony. My throat hurts. My head is swimming. I have vomited a few times. I could still hear movement overhead, but they couldn't hear me. I banged on the tunnel, but the noise was muffled. Nobody can hear me. Everything went quiet. I am still stuck in the mud, so I write this because that is what I do. I hope one day someone finds my journal because I am here, sick, waiting to die. I want people to know what happened to me. It was heartbreaking to read the final entry in his journal. The remains of Harold Upkiss were found in the mud where he had become stuck. I called the police and his bones were eventually taken so his family could have a proper burial of the boy, who had been missing for 35 years, and yet maybe the Upkiss family didn't share the most unfortunate fate. Michael Porter returned home and claimed never to have seen where young Harry had ended up, leaving him to die under the bank of sand just so he could keep his piece of spaceship for himself. He hid it in his house and never told anyone about it. Never may seem like a long time, but for Michael P. and his foster family, it was 2 days. His foster mom took him to hospital when he was vomiting and diarrhea gave way to bouts of violent seizures. Michael died in hospital at 14 years old. His foster family, including 2 foster sisters, all became similarly sick, radiation sickness as it turned out, and were suddenly taken from their home by the military who closed off the street. Within the decade they had all died, most of them due to cancer. They had found Michael's prized piece of metal wrapped in a pillowcase and hidden under his mattress, radiating death through the house. I remember standing at the end of the road watching as some big, white lorry marked British Army wheeled down the road after decontaminating Michael's house. The police and army cleared the roadblocks and told everyone it was safe to go home. At the time, I remember feeling sorry for Michael. He was annoying and dangerous, but he was just a boy who had a tough life. Since I found Harry's journal, it made me feel pure hatred for the kid. Whatever weirdness happened at the cops, people speculate it was some Air Force test that went wrong. It hardly matters to me. The 3 of us were all together on that day. I never should have left Harry alone with Michael. I could have saved him. David Copeland. I open my eyes to the darkness of my room, and the pressure behind my eyes is almost unbearable. My sinuses are swollen on my left side, and clear mucus is running down my nostril. The pain is getting worse, and the pressure behind my eyes is building. It feels like a rusty drill bit from an impact driver is burrowing through the back of my head, and I can feel it getting closer and closer to my left eye. The unfortunate thing is that it is just starting. It is a roll of the dice at this point. Is it going to be 15 minutes of agony or 2 hours of hell? I fumble through the darkness and the pain of retrieving my phone from the nightstand. The time on my screen says 3:45 a.m. I know what that means. I force myself out of bed, and the pain starts to peak. That is the worst part. It means there is no escape. No amount of energy drinks, pain pills, or anything else will make the beast scratching the back of my eye go away. Not until it chooses to leave on its own. Screw it, I say loudly to myself as I search for my shoes. When I get a cluster headache in the middle of the night, the pain is so intense that I feel like I am going to die. I cannot think straight, I cannot fully breathe, and I cannot even stand up without struggling. The only thing that brings me any relief is to walk the streets until the pain subsides. It was a tip a fellow cluster headache sufferer gave me once. Just get your heart rate up and try to distract yourself the best you can. People who have never experienced a cluster headache do not understand why I would do something so dangerous. They ask me if I am not afraid of getting mugged or shot, but to me, the risk of getting hurt is worth it if it means getting the smallest relief from the pain. Sometimes I think just ending it would be more merciful than rocking back and forth in my bed while I bruise my leg from hitting it so hard. But I know that I must keep going. I must find a way to live with this pain. As I bent over to tie my shoes, a clear stream of mucus dripped down my nostril. My sinuses felt like they were being squeezed by a firm hand. I hated this feeling more than anything else about having these things. The pain behind my eye was excruciating, and it was made worse by the fact that I could only breathe out of one nostril. This was hell. I stepped out of my apartment and into the cool night air. The breezeway was quiet, save for the sound of my neighbor's voice slurring through the darkness. "Hey, neighbor," he called. I turned to see him struggling to find the right key to his door. He was a stocky man with a thick head of hair that was now plastered to his forehead with sweat. The smell of gin wafted off him, and I could see the alcohol shining in his eyes. He waved at me again, as if I hadn't heard him the first time. I didn't dislike him, but when I was having one of those nights, I didn't like anyone. I especially didn't want to chat with a lonely drunk at 3 a.m. Well, I felt bad for him. It had been an ongoing theme with him since his partner had left him some months ago. I could hear the faint sound of him crying from our thin walls. "What are you up to this late at night?" he asked, studying me in my running shoes and the gym shorts I slept in. "Going for a walk," I said curtly. "Well, you are a trooper, getting your steps in at this time of night." "It's not like that," I replied as I locked my door and turned to see him still drunkenly struggling to find the keys to his door. I started to walk past him. The smell of gin became stronger the more I drew near. As he began to unlock his door finally, "Well, you have a good night," he said with a one last limp wave as I continued to walk towards the stairwell. I heard his door open with a long, drawn-out moan that was part drunkenness and loneliness. I turned around briefly to see that his door was still open, but there was no sign of him. I could only imagine him standing there, staring into the darkness, drunk and alone. The city's wind whipped my face, a fleeting but welcome relief from the imaginary knife that was slowly being pushed deeper into my brain. I knew it was going to be a long night. There was no point in trying to go back to sleep. I could just lie there, staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. I was already exhausted, but I knew that I wouldn't be able to rest. I had to keep moving. I had to keep doing something, anything to distract myself from the pain. This included what most people would consider to be beyond stupid, but when you have a cluster headache, you don't always think clearly. I decided that it would be quicker to grab an energy drink from the market by cutting through a dark alley. I had cut through the alley countless times, both in broad daylight and at night when my head was throbbing. But something was different this time. The alley felt darker and more ominous than usual. The wind howled through it as if it was warning me away. "Don't come down this way," it seemed to say. I stared into the alleyway, wondering if I was hoping for someone to hit me over the head and knock me out so I wouldn't have to feel the pain anymore. It was darker than usual, the flickering street lamps supplying only brief moments of illumination. The sound of paper and other trash crunching under my feet was amplified by the darkness. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my eyes started to ache, and my vision began to blur. I cursed under my breath as I squinted through my one good eye, hoping it would help me focus on the other end of the alley. It was cliché, but it was true. I had heard a glass bottle break behind me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse from the cold. There was no answer. The alley was silent for a moment, then I heard rustling in the darkness. "Anyone there?" I asked again, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling grew more frantic, as if whoever was out there was trying to get away from me. I stood still, frozen with fear as the sound got louder and more desperate. I could feel the muscles in my neck turning stiff and my head throbbed painfully. My nose was clogged with mucus and I could barely breathe. I knew I should run, but I was too afraid to move. I just stood there, listening to the rustling until it finally stopped. The alley was silent again. I stood there for a few more minutes, my heart still racing before I finally worked up the courage to move. I know I talked about a tough game earlier, but truthfully, when I don't have cluster headaches. I like living. I don't have any cash, and honestly, I'm pretty broke until next Friday. The rustling started again, closer this time. It was moving towards me and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to lock onto the sound with my one good eye, but my other eye was still watering and blurred. The flickering lamplight briefly illuminated the creature's eyes, which glowed with an intense, unnatural light. My knees locked up as I stared at the thing, unable to move. I could see its sharp teeth glinting in the darkness as it slunk closer to me. I opened my one good eye as wide as it would go, trying to see the creature more clearly. At least I wouldn't have to suffer from cluster headaches anymore. The creature slinked closer, and my one good nostril could smell it. It was awful. It whimpered for a moment, which caught me off guard as I stared down at what appeared to be a stray light-colored hair dog, covered in dirt and hardened mud, a piece of trash hanging out of its mouth. It was thin enough that I could see its hip bones. Its stare locked onto me for a moment, its tail lightly wagging. "Hi, boy, I think," I said to it. As we continued to stare at each other, I noticed his ears began to perk up. It turned around and its demeanor changed in an instant. The tail suddenly whipped underneath and its fur began to stand up. It let out a growl as it stared into the darkness behind us. "What do you see?" I asked if the dog could respond. I figured it was probably another dog, and they were having a turf war over who got to pick over the alley's garbage. I waited a moment before I said, "Well, best of luck to you. Give them hell." I turned around and continued down the alley. I could see the light at the other end, but I was getting closer to the corner market. I thought about how Red Bull would help me with the groggy feeling of being woken up. As I was about to exit the alley, I heard the dog barking. Its feet were racing down the alleyway, and its tail was still tucked between its legs. It darted past me, barking frantically, and disappeared around the corner. I guess it lost. I darted across the street and into the market. The door chimed as I opened it, and I glanced at the bald man behind the counter. He gave me a gruff look before turning his attention back to the small television. I looked out the window at the alley, but I couldn't see anything unusual in the darkness. I walked to the drinks and grabbed a Red Bull. My head throbbed as I walked to the counter and placed the can down. The man grunted and stood up from the television. "Anything else tonight?" "No, just this." "Late night, huh?" "Yeah," I said. No point in going back to sleep at this point. I heard the beep as he scanned the barcode, and I took one last look at the alley. "That'll be 319, he said, still looking at the television. "Do you still take tap?" He nodded without looking at me. I pulled out my phone to see that it was nearly 4 a.m. I heard the bell jingle as another customer entered, but I didn't pay much attention. The transaction went through, and I shook my head at the clerk's question about a receipt. I took one last look at the store, but it seemed empty except for me and the clerk. I could have sworn someone else had come in, but maybe they just went to the bathroom, or the wind had jostled the door a bit to cause the bell to ring. I exited the market and started walking again. The pain in my head was a constant, dull ache, but it wasn't getting worse. This gave me hope that the pain was starting to subside. I decided to walk another block or two and then turn around. A few minutes later, I heard a voice from behind me. "You haven't noticed it, have you?" I turned to see a man leaning against a wall. He had a long, unkempt beard and weathered skin. His eyes were tired, but they locked onto mine with a piercing intensity. "Noticed what?" I asked. "That you're being followed?" He replied, turning his head to the street behind us. The lights on the street began to flicker, just like they had in the alley I had walked through earlier. "It's been following you for a while now." What's been following me? I asked, my voice rising in alarm. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me with those intense eyes as if he were trying to read my mind. Finally, he spoke. Something dark, he said. Something that wants to hurt you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What should I do? I asked. Get as far from it as you can, he replied, his voice thick with urgency. You aren't the first person I've seen it follow. The man stood up and started to dust himself off, but his eyes were fixed on me with a look of fear. The lights began to flicker more erratically, and I could almost feel the darkness closing in around us. I still can't see anything, I said, my voice trembling. That's because it doesn't want you to see it, he said. It likes to toy with people. You'll be dead before they get here, the man replied. You're not the first person I've seen try that. I'm getting the hell out of here. My left eye started to water and get blurry again. I had to get back to my apartment quickly. I could cut down another alley and circle back around. The man gathered up his bedding and rolled it up. Don't be an idiot, he said as he started to walk down the street. Start moving and don't follow me. I've already stuck my neck out enough for you tonight. I looked over to another alley and headed towards it, running as quickly as I could. The lights began to flicker as I passed them, and I turned back to see a figure standing in the entrance of the alley. I couldn't make it out much, but I knew it was the thing that had been following me. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and continued to run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The alley was dark and narrow, and I could barely see where I was going. I tripped and fell, scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled to my feet and kept running. I could hear the figure getting closer. I was running out of breath and my legs were starting to ache. I knew I couldn't keep running much longer. Suddenly I saw a light at the end of the alley. I ran towards it and burst out onto the street. I looked back, but the figure was gone. The sound of sirens and an ambulance rushed past me as I exited the alley, turning into the other streets. I looked left and could see my building. The sound of more sirens was getting closer, and I could hear the blue lights of police cars rushing to follow the ambulance. I caught my breath, and it seemed that the commotion had gotten whatever it was to back off. I started to take a light jog towards my building. It took a few minutes, but I arrived at my building and noticed that both the ambulance and the cops were on the other side, seemingly at the market I was at earlier. What? I said out loud as I started going up the stairs to my floor. I decided I would call the police when I got safely inside my apartment. I started to walk up the stairs and noticed that my neighbor's door was still open as I got closer to my own apartment. Hello? I called out as I got to his door. I peered into the darkness and noticed nothing at first until I looked down to see a pool of blood and my now lifeless neighbor's body. The sign of deep bloody marks on his torso. I quickly moved towards my apartment, struggling to open the door, but I eventually got in and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and began to dial 911, but suddenly the lights began to flicker. I looked towards the window that was once again open and my heart sank. I knew that I wasn't alone. I could see the figure standing on the other end of the room as the lights flickered. Its skin was almost a perfect white, and it seemed faceless, but as if it was looking at me even with the absence of eyes. It was tall and thin, and its limbs were long and spindly. The only thing I could see that stood out from its lack of features was that it seemed to have strange symbols branded on its body. The symbols were a deep red, and they seemed to be burned into its skin. They were all different shapes and sizes, and they seemed to have no pattern to them. I could also hear it breathing heavily. But where the air was entering and leaving, I could not tell you. It began to lumber towards me, still toying with me. It almost seemed to feed off the paralysis I was feeling. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my breath was coming in short gasps. I closed my eyes, waiting for both my life and the horrible headache that was finally starting to fade to end. But then, I heard a noise. It was faint, but it was enough to make me open my eyes. The figure had stopped moving, and it was now staring at me. Its eyes were empty sockets, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen with fear. The figure took a step towards me, and I could see that the symbols on its body were moving. They were writhing and twisting like they were alive. I knew that I was in danger, but I couldn't move. I was completely at its mercy. The figure took another step towards me, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But the end never came. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. I looked at the window to see that the sun was starting to rise, and my apartment was completely empty.